Now that you have selected your primary antibody, let's start thinking about your secondary antibody. The first thing you want to make sure is that your secondary antibody can recognize your primary, and you do that by looking at their host species. So for example, if your primary antibody is a mouse antibody, you want to make sure your secondary is an anti-mouse secondary antibody. Don't forget to take into consideration isotypes and subclasses. If you happen to be unsure about the details of your primary antibody, which can happen sometimes with homemade antibodies, you want to make sure you use a secondary that can recognize the whole primary antibody, such as a polyvalent secondary antibody, or one that is light chain specific, or even one that recognizes the whole FAB portion of your primary antibody. Secondary antibodies are polyclonal, and therefore they have a tendency to cross-react with antigens other than the ones they were designed to recognize. Especially when you are multiplexing, you really want to make sure your secondary antibodies are highly cross-absorbed. That will ensure they will not recognize other antibodies that you may be using on that assay. Highly cross-absorbed secondary antibodies go through extra steps of purification in order to eliminate those antibodies that would recognize antigens different than the ones they should. That is particularly important when you are multiplexing your targets. In a multiplexing scenario, it's also important to use secondary antibodies that have been labeled with fluorophores whose electromagnetic spectrum does not overlap. If you have more questions on secondary antibody labeling, please refer to our other course on antibodies ins and outs. In some cases, you may not be able to find secondary antibodies that fit your criteria. If that is your case, remember you can always generate antibodies yourself or custom order them. It may also be a good alternative for you to do the labeling yourself. You can label your secondary antibody, or you can also label your primary antibody as we have just discussed. Just keep in mind that if you decide to label your primary antibody, you're not going to have the signal amplification offered by the secondary antibody.